Welcome to 3 Point Cyber, a podcast about cybersecurity topics and events for the layperson. The ideas, opinions, and discussions of this podcast are those of the host, co-host, and guest, and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective employers or affiliates. Recording and propagation of this podcast is highly encouraged as long as an acknowledgement is given to the ownership. Music and graphics used in the podcast and promotional materials cannot be used in other events not tied to the podcast without the express written consent from Alpha Omega Advisors. Well, we're here, ready for episode 3. It's been, the first couple of episodes have been very interesting, a couple of great guests, and we've certainly covered a lot of information. And we're going to cover a lot of information in this episode as well.
How you doing, Dave?
Good. How are you?
I am wonderful, thank you. Today is Becca. For the audience, Becca is my sister. It's her birthday. And I gave her a call, and as I was talking to her, I was actually talking about the podcast. She told me that gave away something you referenced in the first episode about hiding your head in the sand.
He did, yeah. So that
and
was,
I will tell you, until today, I did not know who you were talking about.
Well, I said you knew him.
Now I do.
Yeah, I said you knew him when I mentioned it. And what we're referring to is we named our first episode "Don't Bury Your Head in the Sand," and I mentioned to Andrew on that episode that there was already someone that he knew that didn't like the title of the first episode because it just didn't sound appealing, and he wouldn't want his head buried in the sand, so why would he listen to a podcast? I think he kind of misunderstood what I was probably trying to say, is because we ended up with, we don't want you to bury your head in the sand.
So here's the problem. So my sister's husband, who obviously is my brother-in-law, his name's Hut. For the audience, his actual name's Herschel. We call him Hut, and we love him dearly, but he's a salesman. And as a salesman, you're very much into marketing. And the thing about marketing is it's all so subjective that just because it's his opinion doesn't mean that it's an actual bad idea. And
okay, so now I hear I feel like we're getting ready to have a big family quarrel here on our podcast. That's where I feel like we're leading. And for my listeners, Hut was actually a choice for the co-host here as well.
Yes.
Hut has
he may come in to co-host.
And he may, because Andrew is getting busy, and there may be a point where I'm going to have a guest co-host, and I'm hoping that he. Now that we're going to put him on the air here like this and earn up to his reputation, I don't think he's going to be able to deny coming on. So this is a good plan to get him to come on. Yeah, Hut was he's got a great sense of humor, at least from my standpoint. Sounds like Andrew might have something with his opinions that he may not care for, but. Yeah.
No, what I would love at a certain point. So number one, I would love Hut to get involved with this. I think it'd be a great idea to have him come on and co-host and maybe even do split duty with me. But I think it would be great to have he and I on here at a certain point in the future. Because I love my brother-in-law, and we do get along great, even if he has questionable opinions about certain things. But yeah, that would be.
I'm glad we got that. I'm glad we got that clarified. So Hut, when you're listening to this, and we love you, brother. Everything's going to be cool. We're going to be good. But you can't turn me down when I need a co-host.
There you go.
Okay. As we move into today's podcast, I'm going to introduce our guest. Mr. Chuck Brooks was named Top Tech Person to Follow by LinkedIn. He's been recognized as a top 10 global tech and cybersecurity expert and influencer. He's on the faculty of Georgetown University. He has been a 2-time presidential appointee. He is a contributor to Forbes magazine. I could keep going on and on. There's so many things that Chuck is involved with, and he is going to be our guest today, and we're going to have a great discussion about cyber. So right after this, we'll bring Chuck on. Well, thanks, Chuck, for joining us for this episode. I really look forward to our discussions. The information that I'm pulling for today's episode is coming from an article that Chuck that had written for Forbes back in January, and it all deals with the statistics based around threats to companies and kind of what happens with these attacks and who gets targeted and things like that. Chuck, before we get started, I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on how you formulated your idea for this particular article.
Yeah, I've been, when I do my research on and for writing and speeches that I give, I look at, where the trends are. And I said, oh my gosh, the trends are so bad with the number of breaches this past year. Mm-hmm. And this is after the second year of COVID. Everyone talked about, remote work being an opportunity for hackers, and there was, and they went way up, but it went way up after that too. So I thought, let me take a deeper dive on see what other stats relate to the environment we're in right now, and try and interpret it why there's so many attacks and every type of attack, from ransomware to just regular malware to distributed service attacks. Pretty much everything has gone way up.
Right. And I know at least in the past 2 years, we've been seeing attacks that's been kind of unprecedented, and just the frequency of them and the type of attacks have completely changed than what I saw at least 5 years ago. So I think in the last, beginning of COVID, I think is the really started doing all of this stuff a little bit different.
I think the sophistication is really partially the automation of a lot of these attacks. So it's a numbers game, and there's less risk for the hackers.
Right. And they're monetizing it too. When you talk about the organized crime beginning to put together as a service type of events and being able to go out and buy ransomware as a service, it doesn't take anyone technical to launch something like that. You just go purchase the service and off it goes. And I think that's made a game changer when it comes to these threats.
Yeah, that and fraud as a service too. I mean, it's exploding.
Anything that they can make money on, they're making it as a service to sell that service. And it's a scary thing. In the grand scheme of things, the internet still is pretty young. It's really in its teenage years. I know it's a lot older than that, but it's still really, from a maturity standpoint, it's still being defined. No, I don't think anything in our history have we ever had that has not been under some kind of a regulation, where we have borders put around it and someone overseeing it. And the internet's not like that. It's just completely wide open. And I think that's what's made it conducive to these types of this type of activity.
Exactly. And it was never built for security. That's the other aspect of the internet. It was designed for communications, not for security.
Right. The amazing part of that, Chuck, is that's kind of what happens with technology in the long run anyway. Ever since we started tech, everything was built to get it out quickly and make money off of it. Security was never a thought in the whole process of developing anything. And that includes applications. It just includes hardware. And I think that's, we're culminating into this age where now we're saying, we should have probably included security, at the beginning of things. And that's why I think I saw things change in the last several years and how we're creating new things and manufacturing new things. And security is starting to be part of that upfront discussion.
Exactly. And I think that's the reason for the whole zero trust initiative too, is because, the cat's already out of the barn, or whatever you want to call it. The horse out of the barn. I think that the issue here is that, with all the legacy systems and all the problems that are already there, you have to sort of look at it in a holistic way and go through a zero risk approach to trying to determine where your gaps are and try and fix them. So,
right.
Chuck, so you brought something up that I would like to touch on. I read your article and it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Do have some questions though. When you brought up zero trust, what do you mean by zero trust framework?
Yeah, well, exactly what it is. It's a framework. It's not a solution. And the whole idea of zero trust is you implicitly don't trust anything. So you're not just talking about devices and hardware and software, you're also talking about people. So if you approach it from a risk management strategy, then you really need to do an inventory of everything you have connected to your network and determine whether it's authenticated and it should be there. And that alone would help steer a lot of the breaches away. I think the problem is, for most companies, and particularly for government, is they just didn't have the expertise and the people to do it. And now I think that they're mandating it in this White House memorandum. I think there'll be more of a trend of people learning to do this risk management approach and take maybe some of the lessons learned from places like NERC, industrial cybersecurity, where they do some of that already. But it makes sense. It's really not a solution, but it makes sense.
So is this something that is being implemented in the business world, or is this a governmental initiative?
Right now, it's mostly government, but I'm talking to some companies that are doing it or have been doing it. I think, the best example of that is probably casinos. They've done this from the very beginning. They don't trust anything, not even a thermometer on a fish tank, and everything is air gap. So, really, and every person they look at, it's really their approach now being adopted by the government. There are industries that do it, and, they're continually evaluating, and access control and those issues, which is really an important part of zero trust. And I think that's probably one of the weaker points of all companies is that, people leave, credentials are still open, they have access, and someone takes advantage of it. So, yeah, I mean, zero trust involves a lot of elements. Identity is one of them, but also, authenticating your devices and knowing that they're not harboring malware is another important aspect of it.
Yeah. So Chuck, my co-host here, Andrew, he's been specifically chosen to join me on this episode, so he would keep us down into the discussions so everybody can understand. And I really appreciate him jumping in like that, because zero trust is, even in the cyber realm, if you're in the field, you hear a lot of different things about what zero trust is. So even in our field, it's new enough that it's being defined as we're working through it. And I think we've come a long way. One other thing I'm going to mention there, the Buzzword Framework. I think most people, they probably do understand what a framework is, but in this context, you hear it a lot in the cyber. You hear cybersecurity frameworks, you're hearing zero trust frameworks, you're hearing identity management frameworks. And basically, when we're talking about frameworks, we're just talking about what is the basic underlying concept of what something would be. So that's when you hear something about zero trust framework, then that's something that's being put together and is not a tool, although there are tools that may use the framework. It's not a tool. It's just a concept.
It sounds like another word for philosophy.
Yeah, pretty close to it. We can go really deep with philosophy, so we won't go there. So, Chuck, let's kind of get to the article here. And I know there are many, many threats out there. But as we move into these stats, can you kind of give us like the top 2 or 3 that you're seeing, and maybe something that's even coming up?
You have to. I mean, ransomware has been around for a long time, but I think in this last couple of years, it's really changed in its application. One, as I mentioned earlier, the automation of it. But second is that now that we're in a cryptocurrency world, the criminals get paid easier. And it's harder to trace. Before, it was bank accounts and cash stuff, and it was, there's ways to track them down. Now it's so plentiful and so many different types of cryptocurrencies. They have found that, oh wow, this is a great opportunity to go back to using ransomware, and they have done it, and they have targeted a lot of healthcare organizations because they can't afford not to pay the ransom in many cases because of liabilities or issues, or they just don't have security. So they've really taken advantage of that ransomware opportunity. And there's also some new types of ransomware that are more sophisticated are being used too. And a lot of this is coming out of sort of a loosely affiliated organized crime gangs out of Russia. They've made it a sort of an instrument of policy almost to use this ransomware to show vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure in other places in the West, in the United States too, with the other places like the Colonial Pipeline issue is a good example of that. So I think definitely ransomware is one. I think also with you're seeing a lot more sophisticated phishing. Phishing's also been around and still the number one threat. But now with a lot of deep fake capabilities and artificial intelligence, they can mimic people. They could, the graphics now are incredible. It looks like it's a letter coming from your bank. They could do it now by text too. So you're seeing a whole line of fraud coming out of the identity management, where they're exfiltrating your data and helping to get your funds, changing your passwords and getting your credit cards and bank information. So you're seeing a lot of phishing, more than usual, even though it's always been prevalent.
Yeah, so some of the stats that you brought up in this article, it can really be startling to people that aren't paying that close attention to things. But I'm going to pull out a few key ones here, and maybe you can talk through them. Speaking of ransomwares and other malware events or threats that are going against our businesses, one of the things that caught my eye here is you were talking about the most targeted sectors worldwide by hackers in 2021. And I'm assuming these are probably going to stay the same going into 2022. But from a sector standpoint, you mentioned that 75% of the targeted sectors is in education, the research sector. 71% is in healthcare. 67% are with the internet service providers and the managed service providers, and then followed by 51% of them are in communications. And then obviously only 47% is targeting the government and the military. So talk a little bit about about that?
Yeah, I think it goes back again to a lot of it linked to the ransomware, with particularly with healthcare and education. Education is an interesting target because if you go to a university, you're going to find a lot of different networks, a lot of different devices connected, and almost no security. And I could say that from being in the education world, but there's a change now. A lot of the bigger universities have invested heavily in this, but hackers knew this. I mean, there's an easy way to get in. You get students make great target, universities make great target. They have endowments, they have programs, and they pay. So they targeted education. Healthcare, as I just mentioned earlier, I mean, again, another thing is it just can't not pay for the most part. Even, they just don't have the budgets or the expertise in hospitals and healthcare facilities when they're threatened to close the whole place down. They have a bunch of patients waiting on to get treated. So those issues make it really, if you're criminals, you go where you logically look at where it's the easiest. So it makes sense that those two are the bigger ones. And when you mention with the government, it makes sense too, because really the government is really state sponsored. State actors are mostly focusing on critical infrastructure, particularly I would say the Chinese. So there may not be as much in volume, but they're really targeted. They've done very well too. As a matter of fact, if you remember back, they stole all the OPM personnel files, etc.
Oh yes.
Yeah, Andrew and I both have been. we know that one very well.
Yeah. So I mean, it's if you look at the level and the impact of it, you can get, it's almost misleading because obviously all those other industries are really worrisome. But if they're successful in critical infrastructure, and a hack like Colonial Pipeline is an example of what can happen. If they take out the grid or take out something, a water plant, it could have huge implications. So it's not necessarily the number of attacks, but or the frequency of the attacks, but it's the lethality of some of these attacks. So, but again, looking at those statistics, I think they're all alarming and not surprising with communications because again, who controls information, the way things are done, and they're also ubiquitous in every country. So communication is a really easy target too, and again, you don't have a lot of the expertise and cyber people in there. The one area where you do have more, but there are probably a lot of attacks, but they're not as successful as the financial industry, which has invested heavily in protecting themselves in the last decade. And they're usually the first to use new techniques and technologies and hire the best people.
Right.
And that's been problematic for other industries because they take them.
And I can remember probably 5, maybe 6 years ago, I can remember that the finance sector was one of the top sectors that were being hit. And as your stats are showing, that's slowly going down. I think it's all due to that. They have been investing in security. They have been hiring the right people. And the programs, I know several people in the finance industry that are running programs, and they are on top of it. I think mainly because they realize that they've got there's a lot of money there to be, to be frauded out of. And so I think that's one of the reasons.
I recently heard that banks, in order for businesses to get loans, are starting to require them to have a cyber security plan in place, which was interesting to me. I'm wondering also if that would affect interest rates at some point, or if that's something we could look for in the future. But I was thinking about cost drivers and prevention versus mitigation. And, in my mind, prevention is keeping it from happening, while mitigation is it's happened. Now you're trying to lessen the effects of it. Chuck, what's the biggest cost driver in your opinion? Is it prevention or mitigation?
It changes depending upon the trends. For a while it was in mitigation, but I think right now what you just said with the banks is really kudos to them. I think it starts at the beginning. It starts with cyber hygiene, knowing that, what to have strong passwords, patch your stuff, use updated antivirus software, etc., and monitor. If you do that, you're going to negate a lot of the threats. And I think that industry is recognizing that. And I think part of the trend of that is due to a lot of the bigger companies hiring cybersecurity experts to the C-suite, which have been basically never been the case. Security has always been looked at as a cost item, just like accounting. But right now, it really is a viability item for your business. If you're attacked, if you're a small or medium business, you're going to be out of business 40% of the time. So it's a real problem. And I think there is a sea change now. I think it's looking more again towards swinging back towards prevention, although all of them are important. If you look at it holistically, you have to have, assume that you're going to be hacked, even if you have the best security, have a mitigation plan in place, and have incident response plan too. And I think this is an educational process for programs like yours. I mean, the more you get this out to the business world, the more prepared they are going to deal with it if they do get hacked.
Right. You mentioned something, Chuck, that I completely agree with, and that is giving the kudos to the financial industry and what they're doing, because they have made a difference. And I think the one thing about these statistics is it's showing it's making a difference. As I mentioned, several years back, the finance sector was at the top of those most targeted sectors, and now they're creeping down to not the highest. And I think what that proves is that hackers and threat threat actors are going after what we call the low-hanging fruit. They're going after the easy targets. And if you look at this, 75% of them hitting the education and research sector and 71% hitting healthcare. That goes right along with what we in the field know as the most vulnerable sectors because they don't do security that well and they're trying to catch up. I'm with you. I as a former CISO from another research and education organization, we saw that most of the attacks early on when things started really ramping up was actually coming from education networks. I mean, they were being used as the point of attack because they were just easy to penetrate and use those resources in the education sector. I know 10, 15 years ago, a lot of your emails that you were getting in a phishing spam was probably from a .edu account because they were so easily taken over. The point is the statistics are showing that the ones that are getting hacked the most are the ones that still need to do a lot of work. So that's kind of what I'm saying. Now, bringing up the pipeline attack, that was one of the things that I think that was a major change in the public's perception of what's going on in cyber because it interrupted and it impacted the everyday user at that point. So everybody started saying, oh, no, we got infrastructure here that can be attacked and it's going to impact my daily life. And I think we saw that in that. So I think the idea that people think that hackers or threat actors are going after large businesses is not necessarily the case. I think it's a red herring from a standpoint of people thinking that it's only large businesses that are susceptible. So that brings us into the other part of the statistics that you brought up. And you made a comment in there that cyber attacks on all businesses, but particularly small to medium-sized businesses, are becoming more frequent, targeted, and complex, and added that 43% of cyber attacks are aimed at small businesses. So let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing there.
And Dave, exactly what you just mentioned. I think they go for the easy hanging fruit. Small and medium businesses, most of them don't have any type of security in place. They don't even have an IT shop half the time, and they're operating on legacy systems, and they don't have any cyber hygiene policies. So they're just easy, and the hackers who are the criminal hackers, it's not just the criminal hackers, it's just any hacker out there who wants to be able to exfiltrate funds, sees small businesses as an opportune target. And so you've seen more and more attacks aimed at them. And I think a lot of that also is because of the automation. Now they know they can hit hundreds of small businesses at once with these same type of attacks they were doing generically over the net before. So I think they're really looking at, again, criminals go where the money is and where they're going to get paid quickest and where they're going to get away with it. And small businesses are usually the best way to do it. And the other thing I think with small businesses is there's a lot of also negligence involved. People leave things open. If they do have an IT administrator, they probably left at one point. They don't have any kind of identity access management controls on them. So again, this is just makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that NIST is trying to do, which is go out to those type of businesses and offer them some sort of best practices framework for their industry to at least do the basics. And again, that's also where managed service providers are butting up right now because again, the lack of people, qualified cybersecurity experts out there is not getting any better, and small businesses usually can't afford them or know about them. So they're probably best off going to a managed service provider who could handle their IT and cyber issues at the same time. But unfortunately, I see that small businesses will continue to be attacked at this 40% rate just because it's easy.
Right.
Yeah, you mentioned about small businesses just not being able to afford a lot of this that the larger businesses and companies would. Is there something to be said about if they would just have more education about password protection, phishing techniques, don't click that link kind of stuff, that would be sufficient, or would there still need to be more than that?
Well, I think it'd be helpful. It need to be more on that, but that are really again, phishing is the number one way of accessing them. So having some sort of educational employees certainly makes sense, and having strong firewalls and other things you can do that are not that expensive, or even encryption are things you could do. And again, cyber hygiene is still the basics for everybody. Strong passwords, don't click on that attachment. That's the number one avenue for getting in. And if they could at least stop at that level and add some of those other level protections just mentioned, I think they'd be much better off. And I think it's an educational process to tell them to do so. And hopefully they will listen.
So I don't know, Andrew, if you've noticed this, but there's been a theme the episodes that we've already done, and that comes into the idea that there seems to be still a lack of some education of giving users what they need to know.
Absolutely.
So I've got a couple of statistics here that I think prove that we still need to do a much better job at education for our users and those people that are using technology, and the cost of what these breaches could do to, small businesses. We've already mentioned that, we're in the 40% range of all cyber attacks are aimed at small businesses. And you've got another statistic here that says 40% of small businesses that faced an attack experienced at least 8 hours of downtime. And the thing that really drew my attention to that stat was you also mentioned that those 8 hours account for a major portion of the overall cost of the breach. So it's not only just what you've got to do to recover from one, but it's all of the incidentals that occur when a breach happens. It's PR, it's paying for usually several different organizations that need to come in and help you get back up and running if you haven't done the proper hygiene on your network. So just real quick, kind of give us some idea of what we're talking about. If a small business gets hit, what dollar figures are we looking at?
Well, it could be significant dollars depending upon the size of their business. That's why so many of them go out of business. What you just mentioned really is dealing with reputation management. And for small businesses, really, that's their key. Their customers go to them because they're reliable, they know them. And when you have a breach like that, your reputation is obviously tarnished immediately. And then maybe the data, some of the customers is jeopardized too. So you have to, exactly you said, you call in people. So the costs are not just the loss of revenues from when you're down, which may be significant. It's also the costs of hiring people to fix the problem. It may be a ransomware issue, so that's more cost if you do pay it, which I recommend you don't. And the other aspects, again, of the legal, the marketing, the sales, reputation, the incident response, all those could be quite expensive. So again, preparation is really important for small businesses. And it's an imperative, I think, for them to take cybersecurity is a priority issue in how they determine their operational priorities. They need to. They can't afford not to. I mean, having reputation damage, it could be fatal for any business.
Going back on the education side of this and mentioning that we need to do a much better job, and when I say we, I'm talking about the cyber professionals need to do a better job in educating our users. Here are the statistics for that. When you talk about the most common types of attacks, you have in your article, phishing and social engineering is 57%. And I've seen some places take that as high as 70%. Then that's followed by compromised and stolen devices at 33%, and then credential theft, which to me can be wrapped up in that phishing and social engineering side, and that's 30%. So the disturbing part of me of your statistic was, as we saw that phishing and social engineering is that high, there was a follow-up here that only 30% of small businesses consider phishing attacks to be the biggest cyber threat. And that was, okay, somebody's not understanding what's going on out there. And I think that's where we have an opportunity to help out with education.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a huge gap. The number one threat, and really is, you said social engineering really touches all of those. I mean, people tend to overshare on social media. It's very easy for criminals to access personal information and use it against you. And hopefully, if you recognize and monitor all your social media accounts as well as your bank accounts, because that's really becoming a prevalent problem. But you're exactly right. Businesses need to really focus on some of the key basics, which is phishing. Have multi-factor authentication for sure for their employees, and use strong passwords. Really important stuff to do, because that's really, and also the education of not what to click on, how to recognize a phish. Because if they can do that, you're absolutely right. They'll thwart a great deal of the attempts. But the fact that they're not doing it or even know about it is a problem.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned in your article that may have to do with education that I found very interesting was that 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs they're unfilled. And is that because of education? Is it because people don't want to work in the cyber industry? Or
I don't think it's because they don't want to. I think it's because the cybersecurity has come on us pretty rapidly. Just think of the exponential gains we've made in the way we do our business over the last decade or 2 decades. From going from mainframe computers to small PCs. Now everyone operates at the edge on their phone, and businesses to everyone. So we're in a different world, and we didn't prepare for it, and we didn't recruit for it. So I think it has to start at the very low levels, middle school, maybe even before that, and get more people, particularly women, into STEM. We need to expand the attractiveness of being a cybersecurity professional. And it's not just coding, as everyone assumes it is. It involves everything that business does. Yeah. It's sales, it's marketing, it's management, and cybersecurity is connected to every industry. So if you have, whether it's going to be autonomous vehicles or whether it's dealing with satellites or dealing with retail. Cybersecurity is an integral element of it. So I think really we need to do a better job of recruiting people. And I think the government's doing a lot of crossover training programs right now, but it's still not enough. As we move fully into a digital era of digital commerce, I think it's going to really be essential that we bring on more cybersecurity people.
Right.
Well, there you go, kids. So stop gaming and start cybersecurity.
Yes, I tell you, some of those gaming kids, they're developing skills that we need in this battle as well. These final three stats on the business side, in saying that 83% of small to medium-sized businesses are not financially prepared to recover from a cyber attack, in which also includes that a staggering amount, a high of 91% haven't even purchased cyber liability insurance. Right now, that's may or may not be contributed to the fact that insurance companies aren't insuring quickly, and they've cut back and they've raised their rates and they've cut back the amount of coverage. So I think that may be one of the reasons why that's really high. I've always been of the opinion, I hate to see companies think that they can mitigate their risk just by buying cyber insurance, which I have seen that happen, thinking that that's gonna protect them, and they're not thinking about the other things that can happen. Chuck, what are some of the other things that happen if a small business does get hit?
Well, for one thing is that the revenues stop. If they can't take in payments, if they're selling products, retail. You also have, again, as I mentioned earlier, some of the reputation costs. Everyone says, what happened to your website? Why are you not there? Why are you not operating? They go elsewhere, so they lose their customer base. And the third thing is that there's other costs that come with it. Trying to patch the issues they have and fix them might be much worse than they expected. There may be a ransomware element to it. It's a risky business not to have preparation up front for small businesses. If I were opening a small business right now, the first thing I would do is make sure security is in place before everything else. And it really is a good way to run anything in a digital world where everything's vulnerable. You want to make sure you're secure or you can't operate.
Right. So, finally here, the last thing I want to say for any small business owners that may be listening in, there's a lot of things that you need to immediately go out and make sure you're at least doing. And if you have a managed service provider, you need to be asking them questions, specifically around the security of your data and what can happen with disruptions if something happens to take down your systems. How are you going to recover? What's your business continuity plan? The disturbing statistics here are that 43% of small and medium-sized businesses don't have a cybersecurity plan in place. That's a high amount. That tells me that there's a lot of companies out there that are going to get a wake-up call and wonder why in the world this happened. And here we are trying to give you the early warning to help out with your company. But even more disturbing to me, Chuck, was that one of the other ones about this was that you mentioned that 1 in 5, which is 20%, don't even use endpoint security on their computers.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. I mean, it's a complete negligence. Obviously, if they don't use endpoint, they're probably not patching either. So you can imagine how easy a target they are for any hacker, not just a state-sponsored or organized hacker, but just someone who is out to basically do damage or get some quick money. Who's just a hacktivist or whoever. So
yeah,
they're just really open and asking to go out of business.
And I can hear Andrew. I can hear Andrew right now. Yeah, I sure do. Yep, you're going to ask what is endpoint security.
Exactly.
I can answer that, but I'm going to let you kind of give the quick overview of what endpoint security is.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's your devices. All your devices, and they may also be IoT devices.
So
and did I hear you say IoT?
Yeah, I mean, IoT devices are.
What is IoT?
Internet of Things devices.
Okay.
They're everything, including your PCs and phones, but it's also including your Nests and everything you may have attached to your smart home or in your business that's connected to your network. Lots of devices now. They say there's going to by 2025 there'll be 3 devices for every person connected, and most of those have only default passwords on them. So hackers see them as a vector to get in.
When I hear the term Internet of Things, then I understand it, I guess, to mean anything that's connected with how the internet or how it works.
Exactly. That's a good definition.
Okay.
Yeah, we had to come up with a new acronym because we didn't have enough.
Apparently.
And it was early on when things started hitting the market, Internet of Things, IoT kind of took off, and it is, like as Chuck said, it's the Nest, the thermostat that connects to the internet so you can control the temperature in your home or your business from them remotely. It's those types of things that are being connected. Your Alexis of the world, your AWS. There's a lot of things that can be done to help you protect your network. And one of the things that I've always struggled with from a company perspective is that users want to bring those into their workplace as well and just try to attach to the network. And that is just not a good thing to do. And if you are attempting to do that, go speak with your cyber group, whoever's running your security, talk to them about it. It may be by policy you're not allowed to do that, and you may be violating a company policy. There may be a good reason for you to do that, and that's why I encourage you to go speak with your cyber team and ask if it's possible. How can we do this? And if we're going to do this, how can we do this in a secure manner that I'm not interrupting if something happens? I'm not taking down company assets.
Sounds like you have some personal experience with that.
I do, and that may be a good topic for yet another day. So we're going to finally finish with the last topic here real quick and talk about ransomware. It's been in the news like crazy the last 2 years. One of the things that I don't like about all of the attention that it gets is at some point, users and people get a fatigue about it. They hear, oh, yeah, there's another one that just occurred, so, big deal. But I think it's important to mention that the size of the ransomware is a major industry on the internet. So, Chuck, talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the average costs of payments have gone way up in the last few years, mainly because companies, unfortunately, are paying. If they're going to continue to pay, they're going to continue to raise the levels of ransomware. And also, the other thing they're finding out is that once they give in, often their information is sold back onto the dark web, and another group will attack them and take it again, too. So they become a commodity. So that's why it's bad, obviously, you don't have to. I say there are probably circumstances where you need to. But if you don't have to pay, certainly don't pay it, and certainly contact law enforcement if you get a serious ransomware threat. So I think it just makes sense where criminals can make the most money they're going to go. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that they're automating a lot of these attacks, and when they do happen, they happen often. They're going to go where it's easiest for them to do it, and they are doing it in bigger volume than they've ever done before.
Right.
So they're opening banks too. I mean, they have ransomware money for banks.
It's incredible how this industry has taken off, and I even hesitate about using the term industry because that almost tends to lend some legitimacy behind it. But it's an illicit industry, and as you mentioned, in 2021, it was a $14 billion industry worldwide. It's just an amazing thing because that industry is only second to pornography on the internet, and that's the other one that is way up there in dollar figure wise.
Yeah. I think you're going to see it grow with the metaverse and all these other things where there's going to be more cryptocurrency available. They're attacking a lot of those wallets, stealing. It's difficult to track all the cryptocurrency that's stolen that you never get back. But once that's factored into some of those statistics, I think it's going to be even larger.
Well, when you're looking at projections, and you mentioned it again in your article, that in 10 years, by 2031, that number from $14 billion is supposed to increase to $265 billion. That's just an incredible increase in what we're potentially going to be seeing over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's a lot to do. I mean, the whole idea of digital crime is different than physical crime because locality doesn't matter. When you're robbing a bank, you have to be there and you may get caught. But you can be in some small place in Eastern Europe using your device to hack in and demand ransomware. It's a global issue. So it's digital. Its connectivity means that there's not necessarily have to be where your victim is.
Right. There's this number here too that you have that every 11 seconds a company is hit by ransomware. So in 2021, 37% of all businesses and organizations were hit by ransomware. Every 11 seconds a company is hit by ransomware. If you think about this again for small business people that might be listening in, if you're talking every 11 seconds and 43% of those are small business, that means every 22 seconds a small business is being hit.
Absolutely.
It's 50%. Yeah. I mean, that's just an incredible...
Yeah, it's an incredible statistic and a scary one, which is growing. And it shows, again, if you're in a dangerous environment, if you have no protection, it's a problem that needs to be rectified through education.
So the kind of the last three statistics that I want to talk about on ransomware is recovering from the ransomware attack. In 2021, those attacks on the average was $1.85 million to recover. Out of all the ransomware victims, you mentioned that 32% pay the ransom, but they only get 65% of their data back. Yep. I think there's this wrong indication or wrong understanding that if you pay the ransom, everything's going to get put back to normal. I would suggest that if you pay the ransom and you get your key to get your data back from that ransomware, the chances are you're probably not going to get fully recovered. There's a high percentage that you're not getting fully recovered from that.
There's no morality among thieves. They don't care. For them, you're just a target, and they don't care if you have your data unless they can get more money for it. So yeah, they're gonna, you don't usually get it back, and that's another reason to keep your data segmented and isolated and encrypted if you can. If you're a small business, and that's another part that they should consider. But you're right. The ransomware people they're organized crime for the most part, or criminals or lower level criminals, and they're all interested in getting your data to make money. And they'll sell your data to others if they don't get paid, for the ransomware, or even if they do get paid.
Right.
So that's why it's recommended that you don't pay. And also encouraging though is that the Department of Justice has just opened up office to really work with this cryptocurrency ransomware issue and spend more time and devotion in law enforcement. Because I think it needs to happen. I need to prosecute these people. They've got away pretty much free without any kind of encumbering issues. It's a difficult issue because even with Interpol, a lot of them are involved already with countries that don't care. So it's a difficult situation. And so I think the fact that the DOJ and FBI are looking more at combating ransomware is a good thing.
And I think that's what's got to be done. You take away the monetary incentive, they're going to stop. They're going to move on to something else that they can try to make money on. And I don't think things are going to change until things like that start occurring, and that the perpetrators or the attackers or those threat actors are actually caught and something is really done with them. And I think that's what we've got to do. In this field, I think the other thing that everybody needs to also realize that the United States is the most highly targeted country in the world. It's because of monetary value. They know companies are going to pay something. But I think one thing we really need to notice, I didn't notice in here, and maybe you did have it in your article, but I overlooked it, Chuck, was that the percentage of companies that have been hit once and they're back and recovered, the percentage of them getting re-hit is above 75%.
Exactly. That's a great stat. And that's because they've already cooperated and paid. And then they're known again as a commodity for others. And again, that's shared among these groups and on the dark web and stuff like that. Here's a live target. Let's get them again. So it makes sense. The criminals will go where it's the weakest, and they know that there's for sure they'll get paid.
Right.
Chuck, I will say that I don't think that I am somebody who's easily scared, but your article scared me. So thank you for that.
Oh, no, I'm glad it's supposed to be a wake-up call. Exactly what you said, particularly for the smaller and medium businesses that don't follow I think a lot of the people involved in cybersecurity know this already, and they're maybe astonished by the growth of some of these stats, but not overly surprised. But I think the fact that most of our industry is not aware of the digital threats out there, and the transition we're making into almost a fully digital commerce, it's very risky not to understand the landscape. And the more we can do to educate people and get them to do the basics and the basics of cyber hygiene or whatever they need to do, or go out and find expertise on how to better protect themselves, the better I think we're going to be secure in the next decade.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of leave this episode with the final statistic that I think is really worth bringing up here, because one of the things that we have routinely come across as a problem area within cyber, and that's education again, and that is that 95% of cybersecurity breaches and attacks are made possible by human error. You can put all the controls in place that you want, but somebody someplace is going to make a mistake, or either intentionally or unintentionally, and that's going to be the result of something nefarious happening to your company, which is why I bring it up again, that one of the things that we've discussed in other episodes, Chuck, has been that we have a tendency to focus our attention in the wrong areas because they're not the main area that needs attention. But this says that one of the main areas that everybody needs to be paying attention to, and that's cybersecurity awareness. They need to be teaching the users what to look for, how to react, how to use their computers properly. And you get that down, and you get a good program in that, and you've already battled a majority of the issues that you're going to face.
Yeah, 100% agree. Cyber awareness is imperative, particularly in today's age. I implore everyone to go out and learn if they're not already, and watch programs like this that tell you what you need to do.
So Chuck, I appreciate you taking the time to join us for this episode. It's been very enlightening, and as Andrew said, there are some pretty scary statistics there. Our intent is not to instill fear, but to bring more of an awareness to what's going on. So I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, we just finished a conversation with Chuck Brooks, and it was really difficult to pick out 3 main points that we want you as a user to take from. But, and again, Andrew, this is called 3-Point Cyber, and the whole point of this is to pull out 3 points that if you take away anything from this podcast, this episode, these are the 3 things that we would like for you to take away from.
That is what we call it.
That's what we call it. So what do you think, Andrew?
Well, I'd have to say the first one, you got to invest in security.
The statistics show that if you do invest in security for your program, for your company, the probability of a successful attack is greatly reduced. And Chuck brought that up, and he has statistics that actually show that. The threat actors, they really do go after the low-hanging fruit, meaning that they go after the companies that aren't doing security well. So that's number 1, invest in security.
So that means we're going to number 2. And being a military guy, one of the things that I liked that he brought out was you got to perform the basics.
That's exactly right. Every company, everything starts, even all security teams start with the fundamentals. If you're not doing the fundamentals well, you're not going to be doing anything well. Cyber is a liability item for any company if you're not taking it seriously. Statistics will also show that the ones that are getting hacked the most are the ones that still need a lot to do in their programs and their networks. So that's the bottom line. Number 2, perform the basics. Let's head on to number 3.
All right. And number 3 is got to be education. Education is a positive return.
So with users as being the highest probability of incidents that can occur in your company, it is extremely important to be performing security awareness training for your users and for your organization. And that includes from your very basic user to your senior leaders. Senior leaders are big targets for threat actors, so they need to be understanding what the threats are out there as well. So yes, education can actually be a cost saver to a company, and that's all based upon if your company gets hit, the cost of remediating and correcting that from PR to technology to just resource time is going to be great. The cost of attacks are high and they're rising, and we have statistics that show that. So again, to iterate, number 3, perform cyber awareness training. Education does show to be a positive return on investment. So that's our final 3 points from this episode. Andrew, any last things you'd like to say?
I think it was a great talk with Chuck and hope to have him back again soon.
Thank you for listening to 3-Point Cyber, a production from Alpha Omega Advisors. If you have questions about this episode or have a topic for discussion or a guest you would like us to have on, please email us at 3pointcyber@gmail.com. That's 3, the number 3, point, POINT, cyber, CYBER, all one word, 3pointcyber@gmail.com. We encourage you to share this podcast with others. This podcast is owned and produced by Alpha Omega Advisors. The theme song was created by music producer Andrew Van Wert in Nashville, Tennessee. This is Dave Summit, and until next time, keep on learning.